Great. Okay. So I'm really looking forward to speaking with you today about exactly what Professor Warner just talked about, the upside of resentment, as my talk title suggests, which is a different way of phrasing the main argument from my recent book, Recognizing Resentment. That book, which was published last October, argues that the sympathy, or we might even say empathy, with the resentment of victims of injustice is vital for upholding justice in liberal societies as a recognition of the equal moral and political status of victims that is implicit in that sympathetic or empathetic process is really a key for justice. And also because sympathizing with others, resentment makes us alive to injustice in a way that no rational recognition of wrongs alone ever could. And so to support those claims in the book, I rehabilitate arguments from some of the core texts in an 18th century period called the Scottish Enlightenment. That includes Adam Smith, who I'm going to talk a lot about today, as well as two other key thinkers, Bishop Joseph Butler, an Anglican bishop in the beginning of the 18th century, and David Hume, probably who you philosophy majors are familiar with, and who was a good friend of Smith's during his lifetime. So just to give you a brief outline of what I'm going to cover today, I'm first going to give you a broad overview of the argument for my book in favor of what I call spectatorial resentment. I'm going to explain what that is before I turn to those historical texts that I use to build my theory, culminating in a discussion of the chapter on Smith that highlights, I think, nicely not only the promise of spectatorial resentment, but also some of the psychological costs that are associated with sympathetic resentment, despite this potential to undergird a liberal conception of justice. Okay. Now, when I began this work, like a decade ago, when I was writing my dissertation, I had to spend a lot more time convincing people that resentment mattered politically than I do today, right? I think it's pretty clear that resentment dominates contemporary political discourse, in part because of how influential it's been in political movements on both the left and the right in recent history, right? So on the right, a grievance politics that exploits things like economic shifts, anti-elite sentiment, racism, or anti-immigration feeling especially, has predominated in populist right parties, not just in the United States, but around the world for about a few decades at this point. But I don't think that this is solely unique to social movements on the right. I think that social justice movements on the left have also been characterized by resentment or motivated by kind of righteous resignation, righteous indignation as well, excuse me. So I actually begin my book by talking about Martin Luther King during the civil rights movement and his articulation of the real resentment that disaffected and persecuted Blacks felt in the South, and the real resentment that they had that led to support for his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conferences, various protests, as well as King's personal appeals to then President John F. Kennedy to try to pass something like a second Emancipation Proclamation that exactly recognized the resentment that Blacks who suffered in the US with no resolution felt. But I also think that the Black Lives Matter protests of the past few years, which really reached their apex in 2020, summer of 2020, after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, kind of capture this same outpouring of anger and resentment against perennial police violence that's inflicted on Blacks, often with impunity in the United States. In fact, some sociologists have argued that those protests and their visual imagery, like some of the signs you see here, really capture or express the rage and resentment against structural racism and violence against Blacks in the United States. And you can see even some of these signs picking up on the liberal conception of justice. So in the top corner, the idea that people who have badges, police officers, should be enforcing a conception of justice that means doing no harm, not actually harming the people that they're supposed to protect. And so this is really capturing a lot of the rage on the part of protesters and the people suffering at the hands of the police. Now, I think this ubiquity of resentment and grievance claims in contemporary United States politics on both the left and the right, and in fact, even outside of the United States, suggests that it might be worthwhile to determine or to clarify when resentment and grievance change might be justified and when they might not be. So in other words, it might be useful to consider a question like, how can we determine when resentment is justified rather than is there resentment, right? Are people resentful about politics? Now, that might not be the only response you would have if you notice this phenomenon, the kind of pervasiveness of resentment. You might wonder instead, for example, why we would want to justify any resentment at all, right? You might think, for example, that resentment is usually associated with political violence, and so therefore be concerned about justifying any kind. And indeed, to take another recent US example, the January 6th Capitol insurrection was fueled by false claims about election fraud that were grounded in resentment of what was perceived as the illegitimate exercise of political voice by a previously marginalized part of the electorate. So you can see how this is a real concern that people have with any kind of justification for resentment. Another concern you might have, rather than asking this question, and in fact, recently the political theorist Gene Cohen has argued something similar, is that even if resentment doesn't lead to violence, it might still further social fragmentation, right? Instead of bringing us together and uniting us, it would further divide us, especially when it's exploited by demagogues in populist parties. And finally, you might worry, as the philosopher Martha Nussbaum does in her 2016 book, Anger and Forgiveness, that even if resentment isn't violent, even if it doesn't lead to social fragmentation, it's just irrational, right? It doesn't go along with reasonable people aren't resentful in the way that I'm discussing. So it's an immature kind of emotional response that's self-destructive, whatever happens in politics. And so something that should be mastered, that we should work on trying to reduce rather than indulging, okay? Now, a substantial part of my justification for turning to resentment, despite what I think are these reasonable concerns, stems from a primary problem that I see in a lot of contemporary liberal theories that I want to mention. So as the 20th century political theorist Judith Shklar might have put it, these liberal theories broadly fail to take seriously the intractability of injustice, focusing instead on the minimal conditions for freedom. Now, Shklar insisted that modern liberalism, what she called modern liberalism, which she considered to be any political doctrine concerned with securing the conditions necessary for the exercise of personal freedom, that modern liberalism should primarily care about minimizing cruelty and studying the murky difference between misfortunes and injustices. And misfortunes for Shklar are those things that are unintended and irremediable harms, where injustices are intentional and rectifiable injuries. So if we want to fix injustice, we need to figure out what actually counts as an injustice and what counts as a misfortune. So I agree with Shklar about this problem with injustice, and I think liberals of various stripes should be centrally concerned with how injustice compromises freedom. Otherwise, I think that the kind of liberalism that they're interested in, that securing political freedom, right, isn't going to amount to much if people are so compromised by circumstances of injustice that they don't really get to enjoy that freedom. I also want to suggest that liberals should be concerned with how they might motivate even what are considered negative conceptions of justice. It's not the idea that we have a bunch of positive duties to others, but really that we should do no harm, as the sign said. And so liberals should care about motivating even that conception of justice and providing a kind of strong affective support for equality before the law, which is a key tenet of most modern liberal theories. I think considering the role of affect in particular is important for preventing the kinds of illiberalism and violence that we tend to see on the rise in liberal societies today. Okay, so how might we address this? How might we address injustice in liberal societies? My argument is that in the book, is that something called spectatorial resentment can serve to unite liberal individuals in liberal societies and focus them on rectifying injustice. Spectatorial resentment is the sympathetic and reflective adoption of resentment on behalf of victims of injury. And it allows us to adjudicate between resentments that we adopt via appeals to a standard, and in particular, the standard of an impartial, or imaginary observer that Adam Smith is famously going to call the impartial spectator, and then I'll talk a little bit about at the end of the talk today. So I'll explain more about that process as well as how I ground it in these 18th century thinkers in just a minute. But first, I want to highlight why I think spectatorial resentment not only addresses those concerns with modern liberalism's deficits that I mentioned, but also that it does so in a way that avoids those common or reasonable concerns I mentioned that we might have with considering any kind of resentment justified. So how can you address the problem of injustice in liberal societies, but focus on resentment in a way that doesn't lead to all the bad things that I mentioned, okay? First, I think spectatorial resentment centers on injustice. So first reason it's able to do this, it focuses us on attempting to sympathize with other people who have been wronged and with thinking through whether and what injury was done. As a result, that process of trying to empathize with victims enlivens us to the plight of the oppressed, whose suffering might otherwise be obscured in society, and it importantly prevents further affective injustice. And affective injustice is a concept that's developed by the philosopher Amya Srinivasan to essentially mean affective justice means you have a right to have your kind of wrongs heard or your concerns about how you've been injured heard. So you can see how interest in recognizing the resentment of other people and trying to think through whether or not there was injury done allows us to think about the plight of the oppressed in a way that we might not otherwise and to avoid that kind of affective injustice. Moreover, again, if like Schwarze, we want to consider liberals as interested in minimizing cruelty, then you can see how a concern with a focus on injustice would allow us to do that. The second reason I think that spectatorial resentment avoids some of these problems and is valuable in enlivening us to injustice is that it recognizes a kind of equity among persons. The philosopher Stephen Darwall first highlighted that implicit in this process of moral spectatorship, trying to make moral judgments by observing our actions and the actions of others and thinking about the worth of those actions, is a recognition of a victim's equal moral worth, right? That they have a right to be heard again. And I suggest in the book that it also is an integral in recognizing an individual's political worth, right? That I consider that person as a person with equal standing, and I demand rectification on their behalf when they've been injured, okay? So spectatorial resentment can thereby provide affective support for equality before the law, again, which is that touchstone of modern liberal theories. Finally, I think that resentment, because it is a strongly felt emotion, when we adopt it on other people's behalf, encourages us to action, or as Adam Smith famously puts it, that it calls out for action, right? And so it motivates us to actually do something about the plight of victims of injury, thereby avoiding the kind of violence that's associated with the resentment I feel on my own behalf, first personal resentment, or what Bishop Joseph Butler, who I'll get to in a minute, first calls sudden anger. So it gives us a way to deliberate about anger, in fact, and to actually have the motivational force without worrying about a lot of the extreme or disproportionate reaction associated with resentment, or at least that's what I'm going to suggest to you today, okay? So my theory of spectatorial resentment, as I've suggested, is based on these concepts that are developed in a series of 18th century thinkers influential in the liberal tradition. None of these guys use the term liberal to describe themselves, but they're often associated with things like classical or economic liberalism. And I think the most fitting moniker for them is really something called sympathetic liberal, which is another term that philosopher Stephen Darwall uses. And he uses it to describe Smith in particular, because Smith has a brand of moral and political theory that marries a kind of a libertarian economics and politics with a focus on what's called sentimentalism, or the idea that moral judgments are based in moral feelings, appropriated by sympathy, and again, assessed according to that imaginary perspective. Now, as I said, Darwall doesn't include Hume and Butler, these other two guys. Hume's the wonderful guy in the red regalia, and Butler is the very severe looking Anglican bishop up there. but I think they reasonably could be because they're centrally concerned with cruelty and injustice, as I said, is a focus of my work, and because they see resentment as a natural emotional resource to address it, even though Hume is a little bit more skeptical about that, and I'll discuss that when we get to Hume. Now, I turn to these historical figures in my book for two reasons. First, I want to explain the history of this idea of spectatorial resentment, its intellectual development and the context in which it came into being. But I also am interested in making a normative argument for spectatorial resentment, a prescriptive argument for it that's based on arguments these thinkers make. So I try to excavate some of their argument and then use it in service of this theory that I'm putting together. Now, to situate these three thinkers in their intellectual context, and also to explain what I think is distinctive about their treatments of resentment, we first kind of have to jump back another century. So if you thought the 18th century was already too far back, I'm very sorry to tell you, we're actually going to start talking about 17th century thinkers first, right? And the reason that I do that is the 17th century wrongly got this rap for a while as the age that reason reigns supreme and passion is shunned or marginalized. And it's not wrong that reason is really important to philosophers in the 17th century, or that this isn't the age of scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th century and the influence of reason in life. It's simply that a host of philosophers during this early modern period also started to come to grips with how psychologically and socially influential the passions, including resentment, actually were. So in other words, it's not just the age of reason, it's also an age interested in passion. This interest in the passions in the 17th century importantly coincides with the debate about something called sociability. And sociability is essentially our ability to live well in large, diverse societies. So like modern societies, right? And so many 17th and even early 18th century thinkers are really concerned with how passions might contribute to, or indeed compromise, that ability to live well together in large, diverse societies. So we see various 17th century philosophers consider resentment and the natural connection of resentment and injury and justice in this period. But what I want to claim, and what I'll show you as I take this quick tour through this early period, is that each describes resentment as troublesome from a social point of view, and either morally bad, like it is a sin or a wrong, or at least not something good, at least not an innocent motive, okay? So I start by considering Hobbes and Spinoza, for example, Thomas Hobbes and Baruch Spinoza, who both of whom saw resentment as immoderate and irrational, and therefore contrary to either the social aim of seeking peace in the case of Hobbes or the moral aim of being free in the case of Spinoza. And I'll just note briefly, I don't want to get bogged down too much in terms here, but you'll see that I have indignation up for Hobbes. I talk a lot more about this in the book. Indignation, which comes from the root, the Latin root indignare, which is literally to kind of hold a person in contempt or to look down on them, often gets interchangeably used. Righteous indignation and resentment often get interchangeably used in this time period. So for Hobbes, who talks about indignation, indignation is a close relative of this really bad thing, vainglory. That's one of the key causes of war. If you read any Hobbes or heard of Hobbes, you probably know state of nature is not great. It's the state of war. And one of the reasons for that is vainglory, and resentment is very closely related to that. It's the same form of speech, which is important for Hobbes. And it also, as he says, carrieth men not only against the actors and authors of injustice, but against all power that is likely to protect them. In other words, it elicits a disproportionate response, right? It is something that actually, once unleashed, there's just no internal means, according to Hobbes, in the passion itself to allow it to distinguish between unjust or just uses of force, right? We just seek vengeance no matter what. For Spinoza, and the philosopher Don Garrett nicely summarizes this, indignation is something that's evil and not in accordance with reason, and therefore the free man who acts in accordance with reason does not feel resentment. Sort of a nicely tight argument. Excessive focus on any kind of passion, in fact, for Spinoza, especially when it comes at the expense of the love toward the eternal and infinite thing, is something that he's going to say is vicious. And so the free man who is virtuous is one who follows the guidance of reason and not, in Spinoza's term, unmanly compassion, right? Even though I'll admit that Spinoza is a very interesting moral theory, allows for some other regarding emotions. And even though his view of the impulse for self-preservation, this term he calls conatus or self-direction, isn't necessarily inconsistent with other related things, but the point is passion should not lead your virtuous actions, right? So resentment could never be an actual moral motive. Now, if we turn to another really important group in the 17th century, the natural law theorists, we see a similar rejection of resentment as a moral motive for justice and an interest in restraining wayward natural passions like resentment through reason, even though key natural law theorists, like the two that I'll talk about, Hugo Grotius and the guy with the funniest name in the history of philosophy, Samuel Pufendorf, were both interested in the natural connection between resentment and punishment. They're both talking about when it might, say, be just to engage in war or to punish people. So they're really interested in that connection. And even though those two are also really interested in distancing themselves from what they see as the psychological egoism of especially Hobbes, okay? So Grotius thinks that our social nature or our socialitas is not made possible by passion or anything like sympathy, which I'll suggest later on that the key thinkers I address do. But instead, he thinks our social duties are revealed to us or they're made comprehensible through rational reflection on the natural law. And in fact, the natural law and reason are sort of used synonymously by Grotius. He thinks when you reason about things, that's how you reveal what the natural law says. That said, as I mentioned, Grotius did see the value of resentment as a passion. He claims it's the origin of our universal condemnation of intentional harm and the desire for public as well as private vengeance. The problem is simply for Grotius that a just revenge might be okay, but the best way to actually enact vengeance or to correct a harm is through patience, right? Patience and the slow but useful workings of the law, okay? So we want the law to punish criminals. We don't want to take things into our own hand, again, because of the concern with disproportionate responses. Pufendorf agrees with Grotius about the actual fundamental sociability of human beings, again, in contrast to Hobbes, but he worries that unsocial characteristics tend to preponderate in those things we care about, large, diverse societies. He considers what he calls a too lasting resentment to be one of the characteristics that actually compromises our sociability, our social prospects, especially because it's directly linked to a desire for revenge, right? So passions like resentment are things that prove to be such a threat to revealing the truth of the natural law through reason that Pufendorf says it's our chief care or duty to ourself to gain mastery over our passions. That is, to be a prudent person, we actually have to calm and cool the passions rather than to indulge them. Finally, I want to mention one other person before I head into one other important predecessor, I should say, before I head into the key thinkers in my talk, who's an early 18th century thinker, really influential for Hume and Smith, and in many ways who, if you're familiar with him, you might expect to have gleefully defended something like resentment, given that this person, Bernard Mandeville, lauds other passions that are traditionally considered vicious, things like pride, for their role in producing beneficial social outcomes. He thinks that things like pride drive economic and social progress, and so they might be vices, but we should embrace the role of vices in public virtue. But even Bernard Mandeville doesn't turn to resentment as a useful or moral motive for action. And funnily enough, the reason for that isn't because of its supposed irrationality or its immoderate nature in the case of Hobbes or Spinoza, or even its inconsistency with reason, as was the case with the 17th century natural law theorists. Instead, Mandeville worries that indignation is too honest of an emotion, and so it's socially counterproductive, right? You need vicious things to lead to good social outcomes. For Mandeville, indignation keeps us from engaging in selfish actions like vanity, being vain in ways that actually contribute to the economic order and thus to well-being. And so instead, indignation or resentment encourages us to call for a kind of unattainable, perfect justice at the expense of that good economic and social order, right? He captures this really nicely in the poem he writes in his famous work, The Fable of the Bees, where he lampoons this insistence on honesty in business and politics by having Jove or Jupiter, right, with indignation moved, as he says, eliminate fraud in a society, only to have that society subsequently meet its ruin. So not a good thing to get rid of dishonesty and fraud for Mandeville, or to try to set up resentment as a moral motive, okay? So as I intimated at the outset of my talk, things begin to radically change once the concept of sympathy, or really what we would consider empathy today, is developed, as it provides an internal, or you might even say agent-directed means for resentment, to be able to moderate resentment. Because sympathy, and I'm going to use that term and not empathy, but note that they kind of mean the same thing. Because sympathy requires a kind of perspective taking, I have to put myself in the shoes of another person and imagine what they're going through, or imagine what I would do in like circumstances. Because that requires that kind of perspective taking, both the agent, or the person principally concerned, as Adam Smith refers to him, and the spectator, or the observer of actions and emotions, are more likely to moderate the resentment that they feel, which enables it to become a moral motive. So sympathy really unlocks the potential of resentment in the story that I'm trying to tell. It's importantly distinct, I just want to note in passing, from another moral faculty that's developed by 18th century contemporaries of Hume, Smith, and Butler. And that's something called the moral sense, which is really the source of our natural approval for pro-social actions like benevolence. And this is really developed in the thought of Adam Smith's teacher and friend and David Hume's usual opponent, Francis Hutcheson. And Hutcheson and Shaftesbury really see a kind of innate pleasure associated with the moral sense, which leads us to be sociable, and which is not based in imagination or reflection in any way, in the same way that sympathy is, okay? So the resentment that I feel on behalf of another person benefits from the social distance that I have from the initial injury when I sympathize with them. And the person principally concerned who actually feels the emotion is prompted to moderate their own resentment so that I might be able to sympathize with it. So that's really the promise of this, of sympathy and resentment together. I argue that this transition to thinking of resentment as an innocent or moral motive begins with Joseph Butler, who is this relatively, if not entirely obscure figure today, who is nevertheless remarkably influential on Hume and especially on Smith's thinking about, he was remarkably influential in their thinking about moral psychology and justice. Butler, as I mentioned, was an Anglican bishop in London and also in Durham for a while, but nevertheless, despite being a Christian bishop, he is really interested in grounding his religious principles on a naturalistic and probabilistic moral psychology. He sought to meld reason and passion together in his ethics and to play on previous moral sense theorists with whom he disagreed by calling conscience, or our capacity for moral judgment, things like a sentiment of the understanding or a perception of the heart. So the key here is that it has both elements of reason and passion in it. Now, Butler treats resentment as the paradigmatic social passion, and that's why I'm going to turn to him next. According to him, human beings are naturally capable of virtue because of their natural resentment, which he sees as a universal, everyone can feel it, and benevolent, good for others kind of emotion. So far from disinterested, resentment is a selfish but an innocent motive. As Butler explains in one of his 2 sermons on resentment and the forgiveness of injuries, and so these are 2 sermons of 15 that are published from his preaching at Rolls Chapel, both called Resentment and the Forgiveness of Injuries. He says, as I have up on the board, the indignation that's raised by cruelty and injustice, and the desire of having it punished, which persons unconcerned would feel, is by no means malice. No, it is resentment against vice and wickedness. It is one of the common bonds by which society is held together, a fellow feeling which each individual has on behalf of the whole species as well as himself. So Butler sees resentment as the right reaction to intentional injury, which we always feel strongly on behalf of others as well as ourselves, right? And this is different for him than something like compassion or what we might call pity. And it is something which conscience naturally approves of as a result. He disambiguates resentment, which he refers to as settled or deliberate anger, from the kind of sudden or hasty anger, which is simply an instinctive emotional reaction to harm, okay? So even though on Butler's view, sudden anger, when you get angry at an injury to yourself, for example, is morally neutral, he thinks, as he puts it, that no passion God hath endued us with can be in itself evil. Even though it's morally neutral, it was also what we properly consider to be anger and not resentment, right? So it's our survival instinct, you might say, to resist mere harm, the first part of something like our fight or flight response. By contrast, resentment, or what Butler calls alternatively settled anger, and so you can see the deliberative element there, is the moral response to intentional injury. Even a person unconcerned, as he put it, right, a person not immediately interested in the matter, would be able to sympathetically adopt the resentment we feel when we are injured. Unlike anger, he thinks, which drives us away from other people, resentment experienced on behalf of others through this fellow feeling is therefore one of the common bonds of society, lets us recognize the suffering of others in a really important way for Butler. So to put that a little bit differently, resentment is generous for Butler, by which I mean it's representative of individuals taking a real interest in the fortune of others, kind of the classical sense of generosity. And more importantly, in attempting to do something about it, okay? So according to Butler, for this reason, we should consider resentment as a weapon put into our hands by nature against injury, injustice, and cruelty. Yeah, I'll leave that there actually. Now, Butler might provide us with a kind of radical defense of resentment, and the first radical defense of resentment, I think, but it remains an incomplete one. So a lot of commentators have noted that Butler never really explains how that settled, deliberate resentment emerges from instinctual anger. And he never explains what the sympathetic process, the process of perspective taking, of putting myself in someone else's shoes or appealing to a person unconcerned actually looks like. He also doesn't explore the implications for victims' status, right, for given our tendency to adopt their resentments. He just suggests instead that the importance of sympathetic resentment, resenting fellows on their behalf, is important for building friendship, building that common social bond, highlighting our common humanity, but he never discusses anything like equitable treatment or human equality related to that, even in the few speeches on politics of his we have, okay? So to participant requires, there we go. Okay, excuse me, I had got distracted by a Zoom claim. Hopefully we're all, there we go, okay. To further explore those implications in the moral theory of another sentimentalist who further develops sympathy, even though he just tries to explain the rational obligation of justice, and who importantly brings out some of the equal standing implications, I turn to the thought of David Hume. Now, you might be wondering why I do that. If you're familiar at all with David Hume, if you've taken a class in the philosophy department here, say, because Hume's account of justice is controversial for being conventional. And what I mean by that is not that it's traditional, but rather that he considers justice to be an artificial virtue. It's something we agree upon. There isn't a kind of natural sense of justice, at least initially, according to Hume, or any kind of natural or original passion that motivates justice, including resentment, right? So why turn to Hume if he seems to think that we don't need any emotion to motivate justice? The short answer is that I think Hume actually does describe the affective conditions necessary for individuals to be willing to agree on the convention of justice. And he does this especially in his magnum opus that's famously fell dead-born from the press, but now probably the book that we read most of Hume's, called The Treatise of Human Nature, where he refers to something like a sense of common interest or a common sense of interest, or social trust is really what we would say, that undergirds our willingness to follow the law. So that is, he actually does identify a kind of emotion or affect that motivates justice, okay? Now, Hume links resentment. There we go. Hume links resentment to the sense of common interest and to justice across his moral and political works. Briefly, Hume explains that sympathetic resentment makes us feel the disadvantages of defection or a violation of habitually established social trust, of that common sense of interest. And importantly, as I said, he innovates in suggesting that a recognition of others' equal status is implicit in our treatment of them as subjects of justice, okay? So that's what I'm going to briefly talk about today. In the second enquiry, or the enquiry concerning principles of morals, which is a book that Hume writes toward the end of his life, where he rehashes and expands upon some of the moral theory that he wrote in the Treatise of Human Nature, he highlights the role of resentment and its role especially in exposing cruelty and injustice when it is sympathetically felt on behalf of others, including characters in plays that or people that we read about in literature. And he specifies that subjects of justice, which are people that we are under a restraint of justice not to harm, that subjects of justice are those beings whom we consider to be relatively equal to us, especially in their capacity to make us feel the effects of their resentment, okay? Now, despite this connection to both trust and a recognition of equal status that I think is really important in Hume, and even its naturally agreeable character, Hume thinks it feels really good naturally to resent on behalf of others. Hume warns that resentment can have destructive social effects absent mitigating institutions, okay? So commentators have frequently noted the potential peril that's associated with resentment in Hume's thought for this reason, especially when we feel resentment on our own behalf, what Butler would have called sudden anger. And when it's coupled with complex emotions, things like ambition for Hume, resentment ends up stifling social virtues and becoming deleterious to social order rather than supportive of it, okay? So many of Hume's works, but especially this really popular 6-volume History of England he wrote, are rife with examples of this, rife with examples of kind of unbridled first personal resentment that leads people in political power to make politically and personally disastrous decisions. So a great example is Henry VIII, not any of the stuff with his marriages and divorce or the church, but just the fact that he decides to mess up an established political order and punish people of the opposite party as soon as he comes into power, just to excise or get rid of some of his resentments. So similarly, Hume thinks that the worst kinds of vices occur not only when we act on our own behalf when we're resentful, but when we adopt the resentment of relatives or those people that we consider part of our group. A different way of putting that is when we have partial resentments, right? So whether that's formally by creating the establishment of political parties or engaging in factionalism or in kind of religious exclusion. And so Hume thinks that the best means to deal with these kinds of problems of partial resentment are to do things like prevent the establishment of some kinds of political parties, in particular those that are based on religious or material principle, because he thinks those are subject to superstition and enthusiasm, depending on what party they are, and affection for a royal family, where you just have fealty to a king that can go wrong, right? And he also thinks that it's really important to institutionalize toleration to try to prevent some of these religious partial resentments. So I'll just note in closing in my discussion of Hume that he doesn't rely solely on institutional means to deal with the threat of partial resentment. He also thinks that individuals can appeal to what he calls enlarged reflections or general rules about behavior that consider the perspective of our enemies as well as our friends. But at the end of the day, Hume is, I think, maybe reasonably skeptical about how human beings, how much human beings can actually do that, how much they can rely on themselves to regulate those resentments absent these kinds of strong social institutions. There we go. Now, the same is not true. That kind of skepticism or perhaps mitigated pessimism is not true for Hume's lifelong friend, and we would definitely say more optimistic friend, Adam Smith, who uses an avenue that he sees available to allow individuals to self-correct partial resentments while harnessing the natural sense of justice that he thinks is based on our natural resentment. So he wants to harness that motivational power, but do it in a way that doesn't lead to the kind of injustice that Hume was worried about. So in his moral work, what was called the Theory of Moral Sentiments, in fact, this is the work, by the way, for those of you who might not be familiar with Adam Smith's work or know him in any other respect than as the author of The Wealth of Nations. His moral psychology is what made him famous during his lifetime. It got him a gig at the University of Glasgow, and it basically launched him into the to the public limelight. So in this work, in his seminal work in moral philosophy, he develops and expands Hume's theory of sympathy and this idea of general rules or enlarged reflections, but he also adopts Butler's insistence on the importance of resentment as a natural defense against injustice, okay? He does so by developing what I've referred to as this impartial spectator theory. And that theory is a theory of moral judgment that's based on our sympathetic imagination that allows us to create intersubjectively established standards of right. So we create rules of propriety, things that are appropriate or right, according to this perspective-taking process called sympathy, which we engage with a lot of diverse others, okay? So that explains, importantly for Smith, that explains not only how we share other people's resentments, how we feel them on behalf of others, but also how we can determine when they're justified, okay? So appealing to an imagined third-person perspective helps remind us of an impartial perspective that can give us that judgment. It also reminds us for Smith of the fundamentally equal status of persons. And he insists on this as one of the primary roles of the impartial spectator in his thought. The role of the impartial spectator is to humble our pride or our false sense of superiority so we can be moral people, okay? Now, before we turn to that theory, his account of the spectator and the theory of judgment, I just want to first treat resentment in Smith, okay? So for Smith, resentment is what's called the natural safeguard of justice. It is the feeling we experience both on our own behalf and on behalf of others when we have been intentionally harmed or when we preemptively worry about suffering injustice and we want to deter it. So it can be prescriptive, or excuse me, it can be a kind of defensive stance, right? Even though we might act on it to prevent a kind of expected injury. So resentment provides the basis for our sense of justice, according to Smith. But I would worry with this description alone, right, that it seems to suggest that any kind of resentment would be justified as long as we believed it to be responding to what we considered intentional harm or expected injury. And we all know that we feel injured and we feel like there's injustice against us all the time, right? So that would be a problem if he was just saying it was okay to be resentful all the time. Fortunately, Smith explains how we establish the merit of any kind of particular emotion or action, regardless of whether or not we might approve or disapprove of it. So not just whether I feel resentment and that feels good, or I feel resentment on behalf of my family member and that feels good, but whether or not that resentment is merited, whether or not I can judge it as appropriate, okay? So Smith insists that we assign these judgments of merit in moral judgment once we sympathetically adopt the perspective of all parties involved in an injury and determine whether at first we, and eventually, if we're doing this right, an impartial observer would consider that emotion or action appropriate. And the way that we can make that judgment is based on not only their reaction, but the particular circumstances of the case, including the particular history and characteristics of a specific person. Okay, so it's not just an instinctive or immediate judgment. Oh, whoops. So in the case of resentment, on the second paragraph, Smith explains that we can only sympathetically adopt the resentment of other people and consider it merited when the agent themselves or the person principally concerned has been the victim of injury at the hand of another person whose motives we think are inappropriate and wrong, okay? Otherwise, we consider the wrong done to be a misfortune and not an injustice, not something that requires rectification. When we do think that the harm proceeds from impropriety, however, we consider it injustice. And importantly, as I said, Smith thinks we demand or call aloud for proportionable judgment on behalf of the victim. So again, just as for Butler, resentment is so important for justice for Smith because it's focused on rectifying injustice, on recognizing and rectifying injustice, and on supporting victims. Now, to resent with propriety, according to Smith, as I said, requires adopting a different standpoint or a different perspective than our own, right? It requires adopting this impartial standpoint, which itself does something really important for Smith. Adopting the impartial standpoint forces us to confront a very fundamental kind of equality he thinks we have, our equal status as persons worthy of sympathy, as people who are worthy of having their interests and concerns considered by others. And that is something that without this impulse to sympathize with the resentment of others, we might be reluctant to do, okay? So if we're to determine the propriety of any emotion or action that we ourselves adopt, we have to take some perspectival distance from it. And to do that, as Smith says in this paragraph, we have to consider it in the light which we naturally appear to others, right? Or as Smith puts it when he rephrases the golden rule, and I'll just say as an aside, if you want to be if you wanted to be a philosopher in the history of philosophy, sort of worth your salt, you had to rephrase the golden rule in some way. So Hobbes does it, Rousseau does it, everybody does it. You got your own version of the golden rule. Smith's version is that we treat ourselves as our neighbor would treat us. And when we do this by imagining what another person, or even better, what an impartial observer would think of us, we're going to recognize this fundamental equality for Smith, right? Our neighbor is not going to be likely to think that we are as great as we might think we are. And that is just a very good thing for Smith. Indeed, he thinks that if we adopt our neighbor, or ultimately an impartial observer's perspective, we will recognize that we are, as he puts it, but one of the multitude, in no respect any better than any other in it. Now, if you came into this lecture only knowing Smith from The Wealth of Nations, or the caricature of him as sort of like monocle-wearing capitalist who says self-interest unbridled is great, you might be surprised to see that sentence or think it's a one-off. But it's not. It's actually the phrase he repeats most frequently in Theory of Moral Sentiments 3 times. And it's the truth, actually, that the paragon of virtue that Smith talks about in part 6 of this book, The Wise and Virtuous Man, it's the truth that he learns is to not look at people with contempt and to recognize this kind of equality. Now, Smith is nothing, and this you probably do know if you know him as an economist, he is, if nothing else, empirically minded. And so despite this kind of prescriptive account of spectatorial resentment that I've been suggesting to you, more than any of the other thinkers that I include in the book, Smith also explains how spectatorial resentment might be limited. And I just want to end on this note. First, and perhaps most significantly, Smith thinks that the threat of what I call lingering or unsatisfied resentment, that is when you are resent an injustice and nothing happens, right? When calls for justice go unheard, is a real threat to both political well-being and to personal well-being. In fact, he captures this risk really beautifully, I think, in his frequent references in TMS to a person who's unjustly accused, the figure of the innocent man, right, who's wrongly persecuted but can't do anything about it. He's justified in his resentment of injury and yet unable to escape his fate. Smith thinks that that threat of lingering resentment exists in the spectator too, right? The person who sympathizes with the innocent man is equally emotionally distraught or nearly equally emotionally distraught if an innocent person continues to suffer. Now, of course, Smith thinks that a preponderance of innocent men, too many unjustly accused persons, right, or too much unpunished injury is going to result in political instability. But he is much less sanguine about totally eliminating lingering resentment, instead suggesting at various parts in his works kind of alternative means for coping with the resentment that we're left with, including religious faith. So he has a number of appeals to providence in this respect. Because spectatorial resentment requires sympathy, on a second point, it's also sensitive to the forces that can preclude our sympathizing with diverse others. And so another way that it's limited is if you're not able to sympathize with a bunch of people in society, you're not going to be able to engage in spectatorial resentment. And so in particular, as the political theorist Dennis Rasmussen has argued, extreme economic inequality and a widening gap between classes where they're really divorced from one another socially can preclude sympathizing. And so too can social isolation, including the kinds of isolation for Smith that comes from limiting trade. If you don't let people freely move about and interact with one another, you're going to preclude the kind of beneficial possibility or opportunity for sympathy that's necessary for spectatorial resentment. Finally, though Smith thinks sympathy and self-interest are not at all at odds with one another in the way that kind of bad interpretations of him suggest, self-interest, or really our self-centered concerns, you might call them, do predominate over our sympathetic concern for others. And so he is especially helpful in thinking about the way that self-deceit or our tendency to paint ourselves in a brighter light than other people would, or to resist that need for an impartial perspective, can, in fact, in practice, shield us from those uncomfortable truths about our duty or about the kind of extent of injustice in the world. Now, fortunately, these limitations to spectatorial resentment, I don't think demand that we throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. I think that despite these imperfections, spectatorial resentment can address some of modern liberalism's blindness to injustice and remedy its affective shortcomings, give it a little bit of motivational oomph, you might say. It can alert us to injustice, it can make us feel the plight of victims in a real way, and it can call us to action, while also enabling us to determine the difference between real injustice and mere or imagined harm, okay? So I think those features alone reveal the value of trying to recover sympathetic liberal thought, or trying to refocus liberalism, you might say, on its sympathetic roots. So I will stop there and thank you all for your time and attention. I'm really looking forward to your questions and our discussion. I'm just going to stop this sharing. I can see everybody here. And so why don't, just in terms of handling questions for those of you online, if you want to use the hand raise function in Zoom, I'll use that to be able, or John, you can pick up on that. Okay, and then I'll just take questions from the audience too. Yeah, Lori. Yeah. That's a great question. So in other words, does it just allow us to feel sad for people, or what we might say pity or be compassionate to others? Yeah, I think at least what Smith wants to suggest, and in terms of spectatorial resentment rather than just sympathetic resentment, so not the resentment that I just feel instinctively on behalf of another person, but the resentment that I feel and then have to reflect on whether or not it's merited, what led to the circumstances. Smith at least argues that when you recognize an injury is being done or an injustice is being done, that as he says, it calls out for reaction. So it's uncomfortable enough, or it allows for enough discord psychologically that you want to do something to get rid of that. In fact, as I said, that was one of the real risks that he sees, is that if you're too sympathetic, right, you see all the injustice in the world and you feel like you can only do so much about it, then you're really going to be left with a bad psychological lot, right? So if anything, I think Smith wants to suggest that the problem is we're unable to act in all the ways that we want to, or to totally eliminate injustice in a way that might leave us with some resentment that nevertheless is psychologically problematic. Yeah, and can you tell me your name? I should say this if I, yeah. That's a great question. He does, although interestingly enough, in this book that I'm mentioning, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, most of his examples about sympathizing with others are from literary works. So favorite example are plays from Racine, from the playwright Racine for Smith. Circumstances where he really thinks there are tragic elements or people, who, again, who are often unjustly accused, but for the most part tends to refer to literary works. The place where he does talk much more about our complex sympathies, including sympathetic resentment with historical figures, is in this cool published volume called The Lectures on Jurisprudence. So Smith, when he was working at the University of Glasgow, was writing a third book. And I don't want to sound, this would make my life very sad. So it's not like the worst thing in my life, but it's pretty cruddy that when Smith died, he had the executor of his estate burn all of his papers. And he was almost done with a third book on jurisprudence and a theory of government and justice, which I would really love to have. So we don't have that. Instead, what we have are student lecture notes that were discovered at a yard sale in Scotland in the 80s. No kidding. So go to yard sales and pick up old books and see what you can find. And so there in his lectures on jurisprudence, he talks a lot about Roman history, about British political history, and how we sympathize with others. And then finally, I'll just say, maybe as a shock again, for those of you who think of Smith as the ultimate capitalist and kind of unfeeling about the poor, unfeeling about, say, things like colonialism. Actually, Smith is quite anti-colonialism. He is for American independence in a really problematic way. Wealth of Nations is published in 1776, and he makes a claim for that. And also, he just eviscerates Christopher Columbus as a person and what he did to indigenous peoples in the Americas, and uses the language of sympathetic resentment in Book 4 of Wealth of Nations to describe that. So more historical figures in especially persecutors of the the indigenous peoples like Columbus, and then also the Dutch East India Company really doesn't like the Dutch East India Company or what they've done in getting in the business of government in Wealth of Nations. And then he also talks about some of those ancient and modern examples in the Lectures on Jurisprudence. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great example. I'll say that Smith's, in developing his moral theory, it's an agential, sort of individualistic moral theory. And so in talking about how we develop these moral judgments, including in the case of spectatorial resentment or resentment, right? It's individuals being injured by other single individuals, right? Criminals and victims. And so you can see how that's a much easier moral story than, again, structural injustice where there is maybe not an immediate injury or a more nebulous actor or a group of actors, and the victim is not an individual, but perhaps a group of people, right? Or a changing or another structure or system or things like that. And so the answer is, I think there's some work, much of the interpretive work that I do in making the normative cases, trying to fill that in, not relying on Smith himself, because Smith was aware of social factors. And again, actually to refer the example that I just discussed, the Dutch East India Company is a great example of a just evil institution for him. that he talks about just resentment against. But when he develops the theory, right, it's really on the individual level. So I do some filling in using his examples to try to give this more of a social, make this more of a social theory. Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess I'll ask you like what do you think you would sort of come down on? There's a lot of arguments about like expand interpersonal, understanding, sympathetic, right? Where do you see it sort of coming down and what that could be?
Yeah, so obviously to speculate, since Smith did talk a lot about the theater, and again, plays and literature, and how we interact with characters, but was obviously not around when movies were a thing, nor things like video games that might be immersive in similar ways or tell stories. So this is speculative, but I'll just say, I think Smith would approve of the idea that you had to take the perspective of many different others, that you had to follow a story, that you understood different kinds of loss that what might happen in your own life in the way that, say, good movies often do. But I think he would be particularly concerned about the lack of a feedback mechanism in movies or the internet, social media environments, say, where you wouldn't get a negative reaction if you reacted in the wrong way. Right. So part of the important thing in the sympathetic process, how you form these rules of propriety, is you do things and you interact with actual human beings before you come up with impartial observers, and they tell you when you're being a jerk, right? They tell you like, hey, you can't hit me, I'm another person. Or they tell you it's rude to do X, Y, Z, right? And you form these kinds of rules and you get, importantly, negative feedback. And so I think the thing he would think was missing from movies alone, or again, other kinds of like online social media, would be that feedback mechanism that would allow you to know when you were wrong and to revise your assumptions about standards of right. So I think he would think it would be useful in the same way that he looks to plays and literary works, but it would never be able to replace interpersonal interactions.
Any other questions?
And I should check online too, if anyone on the Zoom classroom has a question, please. Okay, I see a chat. Ah. This is having a little trouble. Okay, we'll see if that comes back on. Yes, yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So I started the talk by talking about Amya Srinivasan's affective injustice, right? The idea that you really, victims have a right to be heard, and then actually there's a stronger duty on the part of observers or other people in the society to indulge their experiences and figure out what's wrong, rather than asking victims to relive their like oppression or relive their injury for the sake of getting someone else to identify with it. And so I would say that Smith thinks that there is a duty on both the part of spectator and person principally concerned or agent. And it's not that you're unable to, or that it's inappropriate to have first personal resentment. It's that it's first personal resentment that has to be checked via the impartial spectator. So you can't just get really angry about the injury you've suffered and not think, what would a person who knew all the circumstances, right, do in this case? Would they react really strongly? right? Would they think it's unreasonable to act really strongly? Would they need more information, what have you, and then react appropriately? So you're definitely due, right, that kind of indulgence, but it's a much more limited, right, and moderated kind of resentment than I think we would think if we think of historical victims of oppression, right? We think, haven't they suffered enough? There has to be a stronger duty on the part of victim observers of these victims to figure out what's wrong, rather than to ask victims to both suffer the injustice and then also make that intelligible to others, right? And I would just say I do differ. I don't disagree with Smith's view that that moderation process is useful, but I do worry a little bit about how much of a burden he puts on victims of oppression. His answer, and I mean, he dresses this almost exactly in Theory of Moral Sentiments, and the part of the book that sounds the most like self-helpy is when something is wrong or you're really upset, the thing you need to do is not go to your friend who understands your situation and is more likely to indulge you, right? But you have to go around people who don't know your circumstances. And therefore you have to command yourself to act a little bit more stoically, right, than you would otherwise. And for that reason, I think people confuse Smith with the Stoic for many other reasons too. They confuse him with Stoicism. He doesn't go that far. He thinks the doctrine of the Stoics is unrealistic for human beings, but he does absolutely ask more for victims than I think we might, especially victims of historic oppression, than we might think is justified. Yeah, and what's your name? Uh-huh.
This might be a little bit off topic, but what role does resentment play in non-liberal society or government?
Oh, that's a great question. I think resentment plays a role in most political society. I think a lot of these guys were really onto something when they said it's connected to our natural sense of justice, but you can envision a society that isn't interested with securing the conditions of freedom for its members, but is nevertheless really interested in punishing people who harm them, right? Or allowing something like vigilante justice, or allowing an eye for an eye, right? So I think, in fact, a lot of illiberal or more authoritarian governments try to harness that sort of resentment as well. I just want to make the case that actually liberals too should be interested in it, and there's a kind of resentment that can be really beneficial for a liberal conception of justice. Yeah, and what's your name? Matt? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So I realized I should have been restating these questions because I'm not sure the online audience can hear them. So the question was about the case of Charlie Hebdo, the attack on the satirical French newspaper that published a cartoon depicting the Prophet Muhammad, which is obviously sacrilegious in Islam. And so what would Smith tell us about this? Would there be a failure of sympathy because people, impartial observers, would never really be able to adopt the sentiments of, say, true believers of Islam who consider this such an actual harm, right? And so your final question, Matt, was, does this actually just show that religion kind of puts a wedge in here, right? And it disables us from being able to sympathize with others. And I would say this is why Smith thinks sympathy is going to moderate religious extremism. So he would in fact not be religiously sensitive or culturally sensitive enough to suggest that impartial observers should entirely adopt the perspective of Muslims who think that the representation of Muhammad is sacrilege, and instead hope that overall, in these circumstances, we would get more moderate positions. And indeed, of all places, the work that he discusses this in is in book 5 of Wealth of Nations, where he talks about actually the useful role that religion can play in education. And in fact, in educating people and having more people compete for parishioners, essentially, that religions will become more moderate for Smith. They will deal with these twin problems of superstition and enthusiasm that Hume talked about, and that's a good thing. So ultimately, he is just for religious moderation, you might say. He wants to do it in a way that the government doesn't have to necessarily dictate, but he would probably be unsympathetic or insensitive to the case of a more religious person. Yes.
So in my understanding, I really like the idea of spectatorial, but even like when used in like a liberal regime, it seems to me, as was discussed earlier, resentment has a tendency to like build or not get resolved. Are there any dangers that could come from that, basically just endlessly building over time and then something like that?
Yes, I think is the short answer. And I think why Smith is really interested in creating what he calls a well-administered state, or wouldn't use the term just society, but a state that basically tries to minimize the cases, not eliminate, because we live in an imperfect world, so we're going to have injustice, but tries to minimize the cases of people unjustly punished, right? Or minimize the cases of innocent men punished. So it's not that you're ever going to eliminate that, but if you actually want to have a stable society and also a just society, right, you need to be able to minimize those things. Yes. Oh, I think Amelia had one more question. Yeah. Yeah. Or butlers, you mean? Person and concerned. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Oh yeah, anytime I think you have a standard that's set up by the challenge of impartial judgment, or really a standard of judgment, is like the challenge for moral theories, right? So for those of you who've read John Stuart Mill, right, and you are familiar with his very weird qualitative hedonism, it's not just that everything can be measured in the same utils and you just maximize those utils. It's that some pleasures are qualitatively different than others, which seems to be anti-utilitarian in many ways, right? And so who gets to determine what pleasures are better than others? According to Mill, competent judges. Well, who are competent judges? And so similar problems, I think you're right, exist across moral philosophy, but especially with moral spectator theory, when you're relying on those individuals, impartial observers, to be the source of value for moral actions. I think the general worry is that it will become relativistic, either relativistic or arbitrary. So who is the impartial observer? Just really your own opinion. You're not actually abstracting for your own circumstances, your own religious belief, say in the case that Matt brought up, or is it unique to your society? So usually when I teach this, for example, we talk about the cases of moral judgments in societies that we as liberals might disagree with, but nevertheless an impartial observer in that society alone might think is entirely merited. So for example, bride burnings, right? Which we think are morally horrifying and yet might be approved of by an impartial observer just distinct to that society. So Smith's imperfect solution to that is really to insist that you have to sample from more and diverse others, and that you should never be fully satisfied with what that moral judgment is. So it's really about continually reflecting and revising your opinions of what's right and what's wrong, and continually taking it upon yourself to try to sympathize with others and what their circumstances are. So maybe it's too strong to say that you wouldn't ever adopt a part of that Muslim perspective in terms of seeing the depiction of Muhammad be sacrilege. But he wants to say that broadly, he thinks this process is going to moderate us, because you kind of have to meet people in the middle. Yeah. So I guess a different way of saying that is just, I think that's a problem that's true for any kind of moral spectator theory. I just taught in complaining about this. I just taught to my graduate students, John Rawls' theory of justice. This is a problem with the original position, right? And his justification of who are rational or free moral persons, right? You're always going to have to stake some argument on that and why those people get to make the kinds of judgments that they do. It's always going to be a little bit of a tough call, I'd say. Yeah, John. Mm-hmm. Yeah, or yeah, well, so I would say two things. First, you can see the cosmopolitan kind of influence of this, that really you're trying to get yourself out of your particular society or your particular religion or your particular circumstance. And the second, he doesn't call it, he doesn't refer to a specific mechanism in TMS when he's developing the impartial spectator theory. But as I suggested toward the end of the talk, he thinks that there are kinds of institutions that allow you to sympathize with more diverse others. And the chief one that he brings up is commerce. And there are obviously a host of problems with that. But for Smith, the promise of globalization and having to try to, in not impersonal interactions, but interpersonal actions in the economy, trying to persuade other people of your interest and their interest being aligned is an opportunity to sympathize with them, or a kind of sympathy. What did I do? I don't know what I did. Sorry. Thank you. Sorry.
I don't know, honestly.
I've convinced you all that.
Well, if there are no more questions, let's thank Dr. Swharze for a great talk.
And I should just say, if this is actually still recording, and to all of you, for the students out there, if any of you have questions about Smith or about any of these thinkers or about resentment, please feel free to email me. My email was up on those slides. You can also always contact Dr. Warner from it, but I'm happy to talk more about any of these ideas with you. I don't know what happened to this.
I wonder if it just pooped out.
Is it, I mean, it looks like it's dead, yeah?
Yeah, kind of.
Promise I didn't touch anything.
I'm not sure what happened. It just stopped.
They got most of it at least.
Yeah.
I was about to say
what
the recording, yeah, that's what, well, we can harvest that.
We recorded it to the computer, so you do need to.
Right, I was about to say we have to,
Get the computer
is the
on.
computer,
It's not, yeah, it looks.
oh, that should be it right there, I think.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
You saved it to the computer.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay,
it
cool.
was so nice to
Can
meet
you
Hey,
dig
let me
it
know.
off there?
Yeah, I was about to say, I can probably put it on a flash drive and just send it to you. if
That
you
would be
want.
fantastic.
Okay, yeah, that'd be good.
Great.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
That's no problem. Yeah, of course. I'm gonna get it to my bag. Hey, Dr. Johnson, how you doing?
Can we get the screen back?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm not sure. They're still on. That's
Maybe it
interesting.
isn't the projector that's the problem,
I don't think so. We could try restarting, but I'm afraid that it'll,
that you'll lose.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's see. Here. Go back to home.
maybe,
Computer.
oh, maybe, oh,
Let's get out of that
yeah.
and take that off. And then,
We're still in Zoom. Oh,
oh, so you can.
well, it looks
shut
like
down.
yeah, let's say, oh.
Once you end it,
Like I said, I think that.
it'll start saving, and I don't know where it's gonna put it if you're saving it to the computer, but once it's completely downloaded,
Mhm.
the video will pop up, and then you could save as, like, it'll be named GMT something,
Okay.
but then you could save as a stick on your flash drive. Is it sort of frozen?
Yeah, because I don't want to, I'm afraid I'll exit out when I,
Yeah, let me see. Sorry, you guys. Things are froze up here. Yeah.
Or maybe
Change
just-
the view. Nothing's gonna work. It's when she went into chat. Let's see.
yeah, it had that weird. Maybe we need to turn off. But I don't know why that would, yeah, let me see. Well, usually it's in those little options, but,
Yeah. No.
oh yeah, it is. Yeah, something's wrong.